inside is alive and buoyant and healthy.
Amen.
And I am convinced when you're healthy on the inside, it will eventually show up on the outside.
Good.
Paul writes, now, you understand what the book of Philippians is. The book of Philippians is a thank you letter. That's really all it is, okay? And ironically, this is very appropriate, Paul was going on tour. And the Jesus followers in Philippi sent cash to Paul so he could go on tour and tell people about Jesus. True story. And so he writes what is the letter to the Philippians as a thank you. He says, look, I just got to thank you. I can't believe you guys gave me this money. This is amazing. So his opening statements, I'm not even sure Paul intended to drop such a profound statement and share what he is so confidently assured of. But he says, hey, thanks. Paul and Timothy will just write and say thank you. And he says in verse 6, there's one thing I want to say to you in Philippi that I am confident and I'm sure of this one thing, that he who began, now he's also, I think, inspired by the Holy Spirit to say, I know that I helped start the church, but it's he, God. I'm not he. God is he. And he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. Evidently, Paul is sure of this, but there's some believers in Philippi who are not sure of this, and the Spirit of God wants them to be sure, like Paul is sure. And I wonder if there's some people in D.C. that are maybe not as sure as Paul is sure and confident, but tonight God wants you to leave this building as sure as Paul was sure that there is a God who started something on the inside of you, and he will bring it to completion. I am sure of this, that he who began a good work, where? In you, will bring it to completion at the coming of Jesus Christ. 3 observations we're going to make, and then we'll land the plane and make space for the 8:30, and we'll just keep the party going. 3 observations. 3 observations. Number 1, from Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6. Number 1. It starts with God. What's it? Anything involving God starts with God.
Good.
Now, if we take this from a 30,000-foot perspective and beyond, what doesn't start with God? It begins with God. You know how people say, I led this person to Jesus. If you're not familiar with church language and stuff, just bear with us for a second. I led this person to Jesus. It's cute and it's nice and we get it. But we all understand there's only one person that leads people to Jesus, and that's Jesus. God leads people to God, and Jesus leads people to Jesus. Like, that's God's work. That's God's category. We don't actually ever get to be in that category. That's what God does. It all starts with God.
Right. Good.
That word, he who began, that word began is only used twice in the New Testament narrative. It's a Greek term. It's used in Galatians 3:3. It's used in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6. He who began a good work in you. That word began is a, it is a very intense word in its original meaning. It is very deliberate and it is very decisive. It essentially means to inaugurate. Whatever God inaugurates, understand how God inaugurates anything. He inaugurates with great deliberance and decisiveness, and this original Greek term eliminates impulse and any imperfection. Please hear what I'm saying. Paul says, I am absolutely sure. You can't exaggerate when the Spirit of God is inspiring you to write Scripture.
Right.
It means I am 100% confident and know for a fact that whatever God inaugurates is decisive, it's deliberate, and it eliminates any impulse and any imperfection.
Yeah.
Now this is typical because the term begin or began does not really resonate at the depth that it should resonate in Scripture, because you and I begin and began all the time. But we do it impulsively and we do it imperfectly. Imperfectly. And imperfectly. Yeah, I said, what? Say something. So, imperfectly, right? Come on. You have a storage unit, you have a garage, you have that closet where you start and you're like, I'm going to get it. I can't, not right now. And it was like 1988 is the last time you worked on that thing, right? Because that's how we start stuff. But this word began, he who began, eliminates impulse, eliminates imperfection, which speaks to the nature of what God is doing.
Yeah.
Which is to say, which will be our last observation, that whatever God inaugurates, if there is no impulse and there is no imperfection, what does that mean? Well, he's going to get it done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It starts with God. Now bear with me, because I'm not trying to trick you or corner you, but it is proof enough to me as a preacher, if you are in this space tonight, whether you were tricked and you were told that you were going to come to this gig and this show and this thing, and you're like, dude, this is church, man. You tricked me, bro. It is proof enough to me that chances are very likely that God has inaugurated something over your life. That God has started something. Here's the problem with God. Whatever he starts, always finishes.
Amen.
So you're sitting there like, you think he started? I do. You think I'm doomed? If you want to see it like that. Or just blessed. Because I think if God puts you in this space, it's a God night. Talking about God.
Right.
Hopefully God inaugurated and started this whole idea that we would be here. Certainly did the church, City Church DC. And you're sitting here and see it. I think, yep. Whatever he started, he will complete. Second observation, whatever God starts, it always starts on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
It starts on the inside. Now, that's where the rub is in Christian community. Because we don't like that God starts on the inside. Now some of you are like, yeah, you do. No, you don't. Because there is no perfect timetable that God gives us that says, now, I will start on the inside, but approximately at the 9-month mark, it will begin to manifest on the outside, and it will be very, very beneficiary to all of the community members who are expecting to see actual, tangible change.
Right. Good.
I'm convinced that sometimes God just messes with us. He starts working on the inside, and he purposely leaves things on the outside that will rub you the wrong way. Just so that you remember that actually the work we're involved in is not uniforming the outside.
Yeah.
You understand what legalism and religion is. It's the inability to work on the inside or touch the inside, so we just demand formation on the outside.
Right.
And if you take it to an extreme place, you get a cult. And that's not what we're preaching or what we're doing.
Right.
We actually believe there's a living God. We actually believe that we can't start anything in terms of life change. Only God can do that. So we trust that he is real, that he is working, that he's actively involved in humanity, which he designed and created for his enjoyment. John Calvin said, all of creation is a theater for God's glory. It's all about God. It's all for God. It's all through God. So we actually believe that God is God enough, that the greatest evangelist on the earth is actually God, and that God is working in people, and God's timetable for when the in is going to change the out is really up to him. As far as we're concerned, everybody belongs and everybody is welcome. Starts on the inside. I love I think it's Psalms 127, I think it's written by Solomon, but he writes, and many scholars believe that it's metaphor and it's imagery. He says, unless the Lord builds the house, verse 1, those who labor to build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. And it goes on to say that I give my beloved sleep. Many scholars believe that what Solomon is writing about is metaphor and word picture, that the city there, and the city and the walls, that speaks of the inside and all that is inside of us. And that literally what the writer is saying that is, unless the Lord builds your house, unless the Lord watches over your city, which is consistent with some of the Proverbs written by mostly Solomon, where he says a house is built by wisdom, its rooms are filled with knowledge, Solomon also goes on to say that a man who has no self-control is like a city broken down without walls. Many scholars believe that Solomon is picking up on the imagery and the metaphor, and he's saying there's a house, and the most important house is not your actual habitation, the home that you live in, the square footage you have. It's actually your soul and your spirit and your heart. But unless the Lord is on the inside building your house, you can get all the knowledge and all the wisdom and all the data and all the information you want, but you labor in vain to build it, because only the architect and the originator really has the power to change you. Starts with God. Anything related to God starts with God. It always starts on the inside. We have to believe there is a God, that He's working on the inside of people. Lastly, we've already referred to it. Whatever God starts, He always finishes.
Yeah.
So much so, He actually, some of His names that He gave Himself, and when you're God, you can just name yourself already. You can have multiple names. One of His names is Start. One of His other names is Finish. One of His other names is everything in between. But he literally names Himself. His names reflect the content of His character. And what makes God God is He always acts in consistency with the contents of His character. That's the definition of holiness. He's always consistent. The moment He acts inconsistent with the contents of His character, He becomes man and mortal. But He's not. He is immortal. He is God. He is sovereign. He is divine. And He is all-powerful. Therefore, whatever He starts, if He would not finish it, He would cease to be God.
Right. Good. Wow.
Whatever He starts, He always finishes. Now, on a good day, Philippians 1:6 is palatable on a good day. I am sure that He who began a good work in me will bring it to completion at the coming of Jesus Christ. What happens on your bad days? When what comes out of you questions what's inside of you. Have you ever had one of those days? You ever had one of those weeks? You ever had a season where based on your decisions, based on your actions, based on your words, you started to wonder, am I even God's guy? Am I even on God's team? Furthermore, is this whole God thing even real? Because evidently, I haven't changed much. That brings us to Peter. Peter is one of the 12 disciples, one of the 12 dudes that Jesus runs with in His approximately 3-year ministry on the earth. As far as best we can know, Peter is probably the only disciple over 21 years old. If you're unfamiliar with the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will discover that upon reading them, that Peter gets most of the airtime, most of the camera time. He is by far the most outspoken of the disciples. A little bit of Peter's background. Peter is he is a blue-collar, average, ordinary, had a very underwhelming kid upbringing as far as we can know. He is just a hard worker. He is a fisherman, evidently, as far as we can tell. It was kind of a legacy thing. It was passed down from his dad. It's kind of all they knew, all they did. They wouldn't have made a great deal of money, but it was reasonable, it was respectable. But he wasn't exactly one of the cool guys. He wasn't the in guy. He wasn't educated. He wasn't very well respected in social circles, except amongst the fishermen. And that's who he was. That's Peter, right? But Peter, no doubt, from what best we can tell, he's a loyalist. Peter's one of those guys, right? It's like, if you're my guy, you're my guy, and I'll kill anybody that's not your guy and is against my guy. Like, this is Peter. Peter's a bit of a gangster, to be honest, right? You got other disciples that are nice, like John is a lover, Peter's a fighter, right? You know, all kind of personalities. But Peter is a perfect picture of the human soul. Peter's a soul guy. Peter's an emo guy. Peter has high highs. He sure does. But then he has low lows.